very much indeed. Thank you all for I was going to say coming out on this dark and stormy evening, for inviting me into your front rooms to talk to you for the next hour about Beacons of the Past. It's an absolute pleasure to share this project with you. Some of you will have been when I came and spoke to the village, as Elizabeth said, at the very inception of the project. It was one of the first, if not the first, talk I gave about the project when it had begun. I can't quite recall, but I don't think we even had any LiDAR data at the time. It was very, very much in the things on the drawing board stage. So I hope those of you that heard that talk will be excited about all the things we've done. And for those of you that didn't hear that talk and haven't heard it elsewhere, I hope you will find this interesting. The lovely thing about Zoom is I can't tell who's nodded off. So if you do feel like falling asleep and I've bored you, that I won't know. It also means that if I tell a few bad jokes, you know, they're not very funny, I won't see you groaning or throwing fruit, so I get away with it. The bad side is that when I show you an amazing slide about 10, 15 minutes from now, I won't hear you all go, ooh, ah, but I'm going to imagine that you've done so because it is pretty cool. Right, so yes, I'm Wendy Morrison. I'm the project manager at the Chilterns Conservation Board, and I'm lucky enough to run a project called Beacons of the Past. For those of you that don't know where the Chilterns are, I assume probably everybody does. You can see them from Iffley on a good day. But the Chilterns is a part of the massive chalk ridge, basically, that runs right the way northeast to southwest across the southern part of the country. It includes the North Wessex Downs and extending all the way down into Dorset and South Devon. But the part that I'm concerned with is north of the Thames. And as you can see on this map, the dark green bits, skipping Luton, a little tiny bit of Bedfordshire to the north of Luton, about 820 square kilometres of protected landscape that form the Chiltern Hills AONB. I work for the Chilterns Conservation Board to run this project, and they are one of the 46 AONBs in the country. It's an organisation that is dedicated to conserving and enhancing the natural beauty of the area, to promote understanding and enjoyment of the special qualities of the Chiltern Hills. And part of those special qualities are that chalk landscape and the heritage that has accreted to that chalk landscape over the last 8,000 years. And also to promote social and economic well-being. Well, this project sort of ticks all of those boxes. In 2000, and as far back as 2009, 2010, people at the Conservation Board began to think about a project to look at the Hillforts, and that part of this was spurred on by some fantastic individuals, sadly one not with us any longer, who had taken some courses at Conted taught by my colleague, Professor Gary Locke, on Hillforts, and they got very excited about the ones in the Chilterns, and they drafted a fantastic project proposal, pushed it through to lottery funding, and managed to secure nearly £1 million for this project. And this is where I'm lucky, because I got to parachute in 2018 and deliver this project. Most of the hard work had gone before, all the funding and permissions and thinking to create this wonderful project, and I had the dream job of just landing and delivering it, making all the magic happen. So this started in 2018. It was a 3.5-year project. I've been very fortunate in being able to extend for one further year to sort of compensate for a lot of things that couldn't happen because of COVID, and we'll hear a little bit about those towards the end. But the project should have ended about 3 weeks ago. Now we'll be going until this time next year. The focus of the project is to look at the Hillforts and the prehistoric landscapes of the Chilterns. So if we think about Hillforts, and we're going to talk about them quite a bit, they are fantastic monuments, but they don't exist in isolation. So they are seated within a landscape, and it's important to think in that sort of broader landscape view. And the way the project was designed was with 3 major aims, or beacons. And this was sort of a conceit, if you thought about all the Hillforts on the scarp slope of that chalk ridge having signal fires, they would light up the Chilterns with beacons. We have some suggestion that this was done in the Saxon period. We don't have any proof that this was done in the Iron Age, but it was a nice concept. So the project was formed around beacons of the past, and the 3 beacons being the beacon of discovery, of learning, and protection. And largely speaking, the beacon of discovery is to learn more about the Hillforts and the landscape. And there are several tools that we use for this, but the jewel in the crown really is the LiDAR survey. And I'll bore you silly with LiDAR shortly. We've also done bits and pieces of field surveys, some geophysics, and we'll see some of those results towards the end, and some small scale excavation. The beacon of learning is sort of twofold. It's on the one hand, disseminating all the information we're learning in the discovery phase, learning more about this and sharing that with people, but it's also training people in new skills. So we've got a huge citizen science army working on the LiDAR, which we'll talk about. We've gone and trained new skills like how to use GIS. Back in the pre-COVID days when we could go out in the field, we trained in scrub clearance and practical conservation, geophysics, that sort of thing. We also used to go into schools, and we hope to do this again, but we would go into schools and not only to talk to children, but to talk to the teachers and to give teachers support in how to teach prehistory, how to deliver that national curriculum on British prehistory, feeding in the stuff we'd learned locally about the Chilterns into local, to making it relevant to local classrooms. And we're doing some things like augmented reality at one of our sites, and crucially, new interpretation boards. Now, I don't know how many of you will have visited Hillforts, particularly the Hillforts in the Chilterns, but most of them don't have good signage on them to tell you where you are, what you're looking at, why it's important. Very frequently, I go to a Hillfort site and talk to people that are walking around, walking the dog or whatever, and say, you know, oh, what do you think of the Hillfort? And the what? I've been walking the dog here for 30 years. I had no idea it was a Hillfort. So we want to stop that. We want to get nice interpretation panels out, and the project has commissioned 17 bespoke pieces of art, reconstruction art, for each of the Hillforts. So excited about getting those out. And then there's the beacon of protection. So a lot of these sites are subject to heritage crime, whether that's fly tipping or the illegal use of mountain bikes and motorbikes over the ramparts, which cause devastating erosion. Some of them have been subject to night hawking, although thankfully that's not been a huge problem in the Chilterns. We're also giving advice to landowners and land managers on how best to look after these sorts of earthworks. They can be very fragile and they require special understanding when you're thinking about appropriate land use. And we're doing bits and pieces of ecological survey, or have done, that inform us how best to share these sites with the non-human inhabitants that have been making them their home for a long time. So deep down, do I think badgers do a nice job on earthworks? No, I know that they don't. They put awful holes in my archaeology. But on the other hand, they've got to live somewhere. So we've been trying to find that right balance between minimizing damage to earthworks and maximizing the habitat and the wildlife potential. So that's the three beacons of the past. It's a lot to do in a 4.5-year project. Here's the area again. So you can see the AONB stretched out in the green. And I hope what you can see is sort of in a traffic light formation. You can see red dots, amber dots, and little tiny green dots. These are all the Hillforts of the Chilterns. Now, you'll note that the ones that you're probably more familiar with, like the Castle Hill at Whittenham Clumps here, Blueberry Camp, the destroyed Cholsey Camp, all these Hillforts here aren't on the map. They unfortunately aren't entered into our project. So you have to draw a line somewhere. No matter how you cut a cake, you've got to decide where you're cutting it. And so for this project, we are restricted largely to the Chilterns AONB. Doesn't mean I'm not thinking about this other Hillfort. The Chilterns has the 10th densest concentration of Hillforts in the country. And some of you may be familiar with Gary Locke and Ian Ralston's newly published Atlas of Hillforts. It's the Hillfort Atlas of the UK and Ireland. And they totted up over 4,100 Hillforts, 4,100 Hillforts between the UK and Ireland. We have the 10th densest concentration. It's about 17, 18 Hillforts in a very small area. So the red ones are ones that the project is doing practical capital works on. So we're doing conservation style things. We're making some changes to protect the site, felling some trees where they are in danger, putting up fences to protect if required, and of course, interpretation panels. The ones that are amber, we're doing not massive works on, but we are putting up interpretation panels and doing some small bits and pieces. And the ones that are green dots are ones which, for a variety of reasons, be it access or, well, a lot of different complicated land ownership reasons, we won't be doing any practical works on, but we're still thinking about them, because what's really important in this is not just to focus on the Hillforts we can do stuff on. We need to think also from sort of a bigger picture point of view. If we're going to look at this concentration of Hillforts and try to understand it in the landscape, we need to include all of those Hillforts so that we see how they fit. You'll see here where it says not all are Hillforts. Kilbury Camp has been kicked out. I kicked that out almost immediately as I got into the project. It's clearly a medieval moated site. It's not an Iron Age hill fort. Luton is a Neolithic causewayed enclosure, and I didn't kick that out of the site, out of the project, even though it's not an Iron Age hill fort, for a very good reason. Some of our Iron Age hill forts in the Chilterns had their origins in the Neolithic, not as fortified enclosures, but many of the sites, Maiden Bower up here, which we'll see more of in a few minutes, Gerard's Cross down here, Bulstrode Camp, these sites have Neolithic precursors, long barrows or other funerary monuments that later, much, much later, develop into Iron Age hill forts. And Wallard's Bank at Luton did not. And I find that just as interesting. What changed there that it didn't end up evolving or having a reuse of site like many of these other ones did. So that's the panoply of hill forts to look at. Now, the keen-eyed amongst you will note that some of them seem to come in pairs. So Medmenham and Danesfield Camp here seem to be paired. Hillfort Hill and Boddington Camp seem to be paired. West Wickham and Desborough across the Wye Valley from each other. Many of them do seem to be in pairs. So that's one interesting question. The other question is, where are all the hill forts here? And one of the things we'd hoped in the project was at the very beginning was that we would discover new hill forts in this blank spot. Spoilers, we didn't. And that's also very interesting. Why are hill forts not necessary on this part of the scarp slope? And then we know we've got all these hill forts over here. So an interesting question for which I don't yet have an answer. And the wonderful thing about prehistory is you probably never will have an answer, but we can have some suggestions. Well, at about this time, it should be, we should be thinking, what is a hill fort? Now, I'm going to assume that many of you know what a hill fort is, and perhaps if this was a live talk, I would say, does everyone know what a hill fort is? And we could skip a few slides, but I will be brief. We get this term hill fort. It's sort of a baggage term that we're stuck with because of antiquarians and early archaeologists, many of which were military men. They came upon these sorts of features and thought ditches and banks, it's the sort of thing we would throw up for defense. So they thought of them, all of them, as a class of feature that was indicative of violence, warfare, conflict. And indeed, if you look at the names for some of the camps, particularly in the southeast, some of the hill forts are called Caesar's Camp, or they have some connection to Caesar. This is because they thought they were thrown up to protect against Roman invasion. A lot of them, Danebury, Danesfield, Danes Camp, these are sites that, again, antiquarians thought, well, they must have thrown these up in the 8th, 9th, 10th century. This is about Danish incursions. Neither could be further from the truth. We know that these are much earlier. And yet that idea of them as fortifications has never sort of been shed. Now, I've used Maiden Castle here, which all of you will know isn't in the Chilterns, but it is a beautiful site for understanding how these places could be used as fortified sites. Here you can see actually Wheeler's excavations stretching off into infinity here in this fantastic photograph. Maiden Castle is, of course, a site where we have good evidence that warfare, conflict, violence occurred. But for many of our hill fort sites, we don't have a shred of evidence for that. And indeed, a lot of them, there is no evidence that anyone was living inside of them. So what we have is a variety of functions and a variety of uses, as well as a variety of shapes of these sites. They're constructed in the Chilterns area between the late Bronze Age and the Middle to late Iron Age. So for us, that date range is about 1100 BC to around 300, 200 BC. And indeed, the earliest one we've got in the Chilterns with a good date on it is Ivinghoe Beacon, dated to around 1100, 1050 BC. And they're largely built from digging into the ground, digging a big ditch, throwing the arisings up to form the rampart, sometimes with a box revetment to hold that spoil in place, but sometimes we don't have evidence for that either. Some of them have multiple entrances, some of them are bivalent, univalent, that's with one set of defenses or two. Some are high up in prominent places like Pulpit Hill, Ivinghoe Beacon, but a lot of them are what we'd call plateau hill forts. So they're on the flat, like Gerard's Cross, Bulstrode Camp, Cholesbury Camp. These are ones that are not on obvious elevations. So there's just a whole lot of variety going on in construction, location, function, and of course, date. And part of this, of course, is because they're built over a huge time span, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. They are possibly defensive sites, settlements, meeting places. I know we like to use ritual a lot in archaeology, but yes, the definition of a sacred space, the enclosure of it, stock control, occasional fairgrounds, any and all of these things at some point during their use, or none of these things. We don't actually know enough about hill forts to be able to say this is what they are all for, because there's great variety. But one thing we can agree on is that it takes a lot of effort to construct these things. And so the very act of creating them is a display of power and the control of human resources, if you like. Now, at this point, I want to sort of segue into chronology for just a minute. Time is vital when we think about how we're going to understand this variety of hill forts. I said they were constructed over a fairly long period of time. But time can be really tricky to get your head around, particularly, I know, in lockdown, and indeed over the last 18 months, time has sort of become a very slippery thing. And sometimes you think, is it Wednesday? Is it Friday? Is it 2020? What happened to 2021? It's all sort of very difficult to get your brain around, and that's just a 2-year period. So imagine huge swathes of time. What do terms like the Bronze Age mean? How can we think about these big chunks of time? Astrophysicists have had a way to deal with this, and astronomers, for quite some time, and they've done a thing called a cosmic calendar. And those of you who might be familiar with the work of Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox, may have heard them. You may have heard them talk about this cosmic calendar concept. It's a very good way for communicating this idea of deep time. And the conceit here is that you say that January 1st is when the Big Bang happened, and December 31st is where we are now. And everything that ever happened in the universe happened in that 365 days. And once you've compressed it that way, you can look at, as in on this calendar, all life in the solar system begins in September. So there's only 3 months really in the tail end of this year that there's been life in the solar system. Everything we know is archaeology has happened in that final day. In fact, afternoon of that final day, December 31st. So this helps us sort of think about time. I mean, to get our brains around huge amounts of time. And I thought, wouldn't it be useful to do this for post-Holocene Britain? So I created this cosmic calendar, if you like, for post-Holocene Britain. Or for Holocene Britain, sorry. This is the end of the glacial period. So January 1st is the last glacier has moved away. And December 31st, for ease of calculation, is the year 2000, although it's rapidly occurring to me that I should update this. But the year 2000, we'll say, is December 31st. And everything here has happened since the last glacier disappeared. The blue bits is the Mesolithic. We've been hunter-gatherers for almost 6 months, almost half of that year we were hunter-gatherers. And that really helps to, for me at least, and I hope for you, contextualize the length of time that we're talking about when we say things like, oh, the Mesolithic, oh, the Iron Age. If we look at the red fortnight in November, that's the Romans. I mean, they weren't even here for a fortnight. They're a blip on the timeline, but they dominate our archaeological assemblages, our narratives, our schools. Teaching curricula is all about the Romans. The Romans are all over the television. They weren't even here for 2 weeks. So this is just how to think about time compressed in this way. The Iron Age and the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age is this Goldie bit and the Hillfort period of the Iron Age, probably the first 3 weeks of October. So we're looking at a chunk of time, 3.5 weeks, when Hillforts are being constructed. If I can point to December the 2nd, where it breaks from green to blue, that's the Battle of Hastings. So I want you to think the time between us now on the 31st of December and the Battle of Hastings is about the same length of time as this Hillfort constructing period. And that's really important to think about if we are agreeing that, oh, we can call them all Hillforts, they all do the same thing, then I may as well say to you that Windsor Castle and a 1940s prefab are just houses. They're the same thing. They've got doors, windows, people live in them, right? So we'll just call them houses. Must have the same function, same purposes, built by the same sorts of people. And of course, we know that's a nonsense. There's varying status, there's varying uses, function, roles, and even a place like Windsor Castle has had various roles over time. It's not used now for what it was used for in the beginning. So if we think about that as a comparison, an analogy for the Hillforts, we begin to see why it is that we don't have a simple answer for Hillforts. There's a variety in construction type, there's a variety in purpose, there's a variety in use. And indeed, some of those late Bronze Age constructed Hillforts, like Ivinghoe Beacon, may have seen later on, early Iron Age, middle Iron Age, reuse with different functions. So it's a very complex story, and understanding time sort of helps us understand why it's complex. As I say, the hillforts in the Chilterns are exceptionally varied. And you can see Boddington Hillfort in Wendover Wood, really large one with single line of defences. Compare that with Pulpit Hillfort, less than a hectare, with bivalve defences. So why are we looking at them? Well, as I've pointed out, we have limited knowledge about them. Some of them have been subject to abuse, inappropriate management. People aren't able to get to them, to understand them, to enjoy them. And it's really hard to convince people that they should care about a thing if they don't know it's there. So that, you know, we've got Desborough Castle right smack in the middle of High Wycombe, right backed up onto an estate. It's subject to a lot of neglect and fly tipping and all sorts of awful things. But nobody who lives there knows they've got a hill fort. So it's just a bit of scrub ground. So why should they care? If you get the people involved and knowing that this heritage is on their back doorstep, they suddenly want to care for it. And that's been a real success. Okay, why am I showing you a palimpsest? I'm sure everybody here knows what one is, but OGS Crawford, who is the father of aerial archaeology prospection in Britain, said that the British landscape is a palimpsest. And what did he mean by that? Well, a palimpsest is a document like this one here, where one course of text, and I think you can probably make out there's a geometrical proof here, just a lovely little triangle. One set of text has been written in one direction, and someone wanted to reuse this parchment. So it's been scraped and reused with a different set of text on it. And yet you can still see the earlier text beneath. And OGS Crawford called our landscape a palimpsest because this is exactly what you can see through aerial photography and crop marks. You can see we've got, you can see we've got Bronze Age ring ditches, we've got later square enclosures, we've got Roman trackways, all stacked on top of each other, each period scrubbed out almost, but incompletely, by the subsequent phase of use. Now, crop marks are a wonderful way to understand archaeology from a landscape point of view, a big picture landscape point of view. But what do you do if you wanted to fly over and look for crop marks, but you find out that most of the area you're interested in is under tree cover? So the Chilterns are 28% deciduous tree cover, and it doesn't matter what time of year you fly over it, you're not going to get those beautiful crop marks to help contextualize the monuments you know about. So what were we going to do? How do we get rid of the trees? Well, my colleague, Dr. Ed Pevler, thought pushing over them might work, but he was exhausted after pushing this large tree over, so we had to try something else. My request to napalm the Chilterns AONB was also denied, so we had to try something else. The technology is LiDAR. So many of you will have heard about LiDAR. This is the laser scanning of the surface of the Earth to create a digital model from which you can delete the things that are blocking your view of the ground. That's probably the simplest way to put it. Essentially, you get a light aircraft or a drone, if you've got a small area to do, to shoot a laser pulse about 1 million times a minute at the ground. And each time that laser pulse bounces back, every time that laser pulse bounces back to the receiver, you get an accurate measurement. So you're able to build up this very, very accurate model of the surface of the Earth. And here you can see what it does. You create every little leaf and branch on the tree can be created digitally from all of these millions of pulses of measurement, and then you delete them and you can see all the humps and bumps on the ground. Now, it's important to say crop marks that I showed earlier are showing you what's been cut into the ground. LiDAR can only show you the surface of the Earth. So anything that comes up on LiDAR is actually a physical earthwork, no matter how small, or a depression. It can't actually look into the ground and say, oh, there's probably a ditch or a pit there, unless there's still some sort of surface slumping in the top of that feature. This project covered not only the Chilterns AONB, which is the green bit, but all these blue bits as well. So all of South Bucks and extending up towards Arbury Banks. It is the third largest LiDAR survey at its resolution in the world. It's the largest one ever been flown in the UK at this resolution. You've probably heard Angkor Wat in Cambodia was flown, and the Mayan jungles get a lot of press for revealing stuff under archaeology. Those are the only two that are bigger at this resolution in the world. So this is a massive project, 64 billion data points in the data set. So what does that get us? How does it move us on from what we already knew? Well, here's where I expect the oohs and the ahs. This is Chiltern Hills. This is Chiltern Hills Castle and the village of Chiltern Hills. say Motte Bailey, and this is Maiden Bower, a hill fort. And you can see in this aerial photography, you can see some hedgerow, ancient hedgerow that had been pulled up. This is a heavily ploughed field. You can probably make out the Motte Bailey, you can make out one of these ditches. But with the LiDAR, you can suddenly see an awful lot more. Now, obviously, those things we knew about show up beautifully, but look at the medieval ridge and furrow, which is perfectly preserved. And more importantly, the exciting bit for me is look at these coaxial field systems. Can you see those there? I'm drawing with my cursor, very small enclosures. These are very likely dating to the later prehistoric period. And as I said, remember, it doesn't see into the ground, it's seeing actual existing earthworks. Look here in the aerial photography, this has been plowed forever. There shouldn't really be anything left, and yet there is, and the LiDAR can detect it. The LiDAR was flown in this survey to such a degree of high resolution that we can pick up anything that is wider than about 75 centimeters, and we can pick up anything in height that's probably more than about 4 centimeters. So it's exceptional detail. And the story that this tells us, which we'll talk about a little bit further on, is that the landscape is being used in the later prehistoric period for farming a lot more than we had thought. We will come back to that. Again, you can just see the detail that shows up even when the LiDAR isn't having to fight its way through the trees. This is open arable ground, and it's picking up loads of detail. We can do things with the data like exaggerate the heights, make 3D fly-through models. This is High Wycombe with all the settlement removed. You can see here, this is the chalk stream valley of the River Wye. You've got West Wycombe Camp here with the Dashwood Mausoleum on the top. Here's Desborough Castle. This rather impressive earthwork is actually nothing to do with the Iron Age. This is an anarchy period fortification. There was a stone tower there for the conflict between Stephen and Maud. That's all gone now, but the earthworks remain. The actual Iron Age earthworks are much slighter and are here, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So 64 billion data points, as I said, what are we going to do with those? One of the things that is so wonderful about this is it allows us to look at heavily wooded areas and see absolutely clearly what's underneath them. So I showed you on arable land, we can get lots of good results. We get phenomenal results once we strip those trees out. It was rather frustrating for a colleague of mine, Dr. Ian Brown. He's been working with another colleague, Dr. Ian Brooks, and the Ians have been over the years doing a very detailed, on the ground, fighting through the vegetation, Hashore plan survey of Ravensborough Castle, this massive hill fort in the north of the Chilterns. And they're about, I think, 2 years away from completing it. And I felt a little guilty when we first got the results back because I just sent this to Ian. It's a very, very detailed, down to 3 millimeters accuracy plan of the hill fort that they've been working so hard on. You can see not only does it give us the amazing result of the earthworks, we can also see all the activity that's gone on outside the hill fort. And for me, that's maybe more interesting than what's going on inside a hill fort. Because as I said, they're not existing in isolation. It takes a lot of effort to build a hill fort, but those people that are doing it are largely living outside the community. So I'm really interested in enclosures and farm activity going on outside. From a landscape point of view, here just for context, you can see Ravensborough Castle is at the corner of your screen here, if you can see my cursor. Just for context, so that's the hill fort we've just looked at. There's another one here called Sharpenhoe Clappers. Sharpenhoe Clappers is one of the only promontory forts in the region, and promontory forts are usually seen projecting out into the sea. So you would have a neck of land thrust out into the sea, and you would put a ditch and bank across the narrowest point, and there you've got a very easily made defended enclosure. Here, rather than the sea, we're looking at the vale, the lower ground off the chalk scarp. And so here, Sharpenhoe Clappers has taught us something, the LiDAR has taught us something quite useful. It shows up beautifully. This is all under heavy, dense tree cover, so you can't see anything aerially. It shows us in these two different visualizations just how different that earthwork here is from the other surrounding earthworks. This is very robust, very wide. These are very, very thin, very narrow earthworks. And what that's doing is supporting one of the theories that has been around for a while, but unproven, that the smaller, slighter earthworks are related to its use in the medieval period as a rabbit warren. And we did know that this was used as a rabbit warren extensively, but now we can possibly point to these as being more likely an enclosure to do with that period, because it's so substantially different from this earthwork here, which is much more prehistoric in character. Okay, so I mentioned 64 billion data points. It's a lot of territory, a lot of archaeology to uncover, 1,400 square kilometers. And at the time, it was only my colleague, Dr. Pebler, and myself who were on the project. Ed's moved on to something else now, as the project was supposed to wind up. So it's just me on the project. That's an awful lot of archaeology to do with just 2 people. So early on in the project, we realized we would need help. And we went out to what's called citizen science. We wanted to get a citizen science army to look at this data with us and help us discover it. We created a thing called a web app, chilternsbeacons.org. I would encourage you to visit it. It's a really fun way to spend an afternoon is looking at this LiDAR, and I'll take you through it in just a minute. But just to show you how the little changes I was able to make in the project. When I first came to it, as I said, it had this long gestation that the project did. People started developing it back in 2009, 2010, just to show you how technology has moved on. When I came to deliver the project, I was advised that the project design would be get the LiDAR flown, and then volunteers would say, could you send me a grid square of LiDAR data? And I would print off a PDF and send it to them in the post, and they would mark up with a biro the archaeology they thought they'd seen, and they would post that back to me at the conservation board, and I would enter it into the database. And I don't think I was on the project for more than a minute or 2 before I said, no, we're not doing that. We can do things much more technologically advanced. So my colleague Ed and I, we designed this, and it was put together by a fellow called Steve Smith in Wales, who created this bespoke platform for us. And basically what you do is you go to this website, you log on, create an account and log on, and it will take you through a series of tutorials that my colleague Ed wrote. These are really fun tutorials. They get you right up to speed on how to read LiDAR and understand LiDAR and what sort of archaeology you can expect to find in the Chilterns. And then you're through to the LiDAR data set. And one of the reasons this is revolutionary is because oftentimes if a project is paid for LiDAR, they kind of hold on to the data for a while, and it stays sort of in the ivory tower, and then they drip feed you some exciting results. I mean, they've been drip feeding stuff from the Mayan jungles for a decade now. We were, I think, one of the first large-scale projects to just say, here, have all the data. We're sharing that with everybody. We want as many eyes on this as possible. So people can log on, they can see the LiDAR, and let's just take, for example, this Hillfort at West Wickham. There again, you can see the Dashwood Mausoleum cut into the Iron Age earthworks. So if I were coming on here for the first time, I'm looking and I go, ooh, that's exciting. I've got a piece of archaeology there. I would go up here and I would click on the pencil, and I would draw a box around what I'd seen. And then this lovely little questionnaire pops up. It's a drop-down box. It says, what do you think you found? Oh, I think it's a Hillfort. Why do you think it's that? And you submit. And that goes into a massive database, which I'm pleased to tell you contains currently over 16,000 pieces of archaeology that people have discovered in the Chilterns. And there are still areas people haven't looked at yet. In the sort of Google Earth kind of, you can pan around the entire surface of the LiDAR coverage area. You can also switch on and off the historic mapping. So you can, check if you see this and you wonder, oh, I wonder if it's a Hillfort, and then you click on the historic map and it tells you that it's labeled, some folly, then you would know. You can look at 2 different visualizations, the local relief model, which is this, also the hillshade, which is sort of that smoother. You've seen some of those smoother images of LiDAR that I've shown today. There's 2 different visualizations. You can switch on scheduled monuments, so you'll know if the thing you think you've discovered is already known about. Aerial photography, all of that. You can layer all of that up. There are other aspects to the web app as well. We've got a blog area, but we've also got a forum, and that makes it quite social. So a lot of our volunteers have never actually met each other in real life, but they talk to each other in the forum. It was particularly helpful during the first lockdown. We saw a real spike in the people that signed up for this project. They could do archaeology from the comfort of their home. They could still talk to people about archaeology and communicate through these forums. But beyond that, there's also a really good use of these forums, and that's sharing knowledge. Now, Citizen science, you might think that we decided to harness the citizen science army because we couldn't do it ourselves, but it's about more than just free labor. It's also about experience, local knowledge, multivocality coming to the whole interpretation of the data. And there are people that knew stuff that we couldn't possibly understand about the local landscape. I'm a prehistorian. My colleague is a Romanist. We had some features show up that just, they stumped us. And this is a great example. We have these pits with these little mounds around them. And Ed and I looked at these and we really had no clue. And some of the volunteers started discussing these on the forum. And somebody remembered that, yes, when they were in school as a cadet, they used to dig these things as supports for targets for shooting 303s. So indeed, we did a little more digging, and yes, that's exactly what this was. This was an area where people were doing target practice. So that local knowledge solving problems. Again, another area where the citizen science army came to the defense of archaeology. This is a wonderful example of getting eyes on the ground under the tree cover. This piece of woodland, owned and managed by a Forestry Commission, as was, contains a late Iron Age, early Roman farmstead, which was actually known about. We knew that was there. But what our volunteers noticed was that in addition to seeing these lovely earthworks in the LiDAR, I hope you can see them on your screen, all these little snail trails, if you like, wiggling back and forth over the earthworks. And this is from a third-party contractor who'd been brought in to do timber extraction. And although the Forestry Commission had done exactly what they ought and had advised them to, be careful of the delicate earthworks, clearly something got lost in the translation. And what was happening was these big vehicles were running up and over these delicate earthworks. So our citizen science army flagged it up to us. We got in touch with Forestry Commission, who had a nice word with the third-party contractor, and the day was saved. So again, having all these eyes on the archaeology has been really, really fruitful. Another aspect of the online portal is what we call the review portal. Now, we've got over 10,000 registered users who are volunteering to look at the archaeology. And that means there's a variety of experience. The output of the database goes into the historic environment records of the different authorities, Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Beds, and Hertfordshire. In order to provide them with the most accurate data, we have to make sure that what we give them, we're fairly confident about. And so we go through and we vet all of those records. So 16,000 features been discovered. We have about 40 to 50 dedicated review panelists who are volunteers who came to the project initially just to look at the LiDAR and to help us identify stuff. They've gone through higher level of training so that now that they are the ones who are vetting this archaeology. And they go through all of the, this red rash across the Chilterns is basically all the sites that 10,000 people have identified. And they go through each one of these and check it against written records, historic mapping, known archaeological reports, and make sure that what people are putting the features down as is fairly accurate before it goes into a definitive database. It's an immense piece of work, and it's truly impressive what these volunteers have done. A few stats there for you. We launched on the 12th of August in 2019, 10,000 registered users. That's probably out of date already. We usually get somewhere between 20 and 30 people signing up a day. Over 16,000 features, over 1.5 million hits on the website. And this represents, and this is so important, it represents over 7,000 hours of work undertaken by volunteers. This is invaluable. This is a project which has revealed a vastly different Chilterns landscape. Over 550 new, unknown archaeological features of real significance. I don't mean like a chalk pit here or a charcoal platform there. I mean really significant archaeology has been recorded and reported to the HERs. That's 550 sites that were unknown by the HERs, which means when developers go in for planning permission, the HERs didn't know about these, so there was nothing they could do to protect them, right? They didn't know about them. And the LiDAR survey has actually increased the potential for the historic environment records and the planning system to protect archaeology. And for us, I mean, that's a real win. That's very exciting. And we couldn't have done it without all of our volunteers. Now, we did find a hillfort, and some of you may have seen this in the news back in last August, so 2020. Said time was tricky. We did discover a new hill fort in the Chilterns. It was the one thing that we'd sort of joked that wouldn't it be great if we did find one? We went for a while not finding one, and then this one turned up. 3 of our citizen scientists located it within a short period of time. And there you can see my colleague Ed as a human scale on the rampart. We verified that it is indeed a hill fort. Unfortunately, I can't tell you where it is because we're still in discussion with the landowner, who is not really sure he wants it known that he's got a hill fort. But hopefully, with any luck, we'll be able to reveal what that is at some point in time. But as I said, for me, I mean, the hill forts are exciting, but what's going on outside the hill fort is part of the bigger story. And that's where the LiDAR has really brought things forward. This is just north of Wendover Wood, up by Tring. And hopefully you can see here these field systems that are revealed under the tree cover. Massive amounts of field systems, probably very late Iron Age or early Roman. And this is probably my favorite example of the number of field systems. Now, these field systems are really significant because people have thought for the longest time the Chilterns is this kind of backwater in late prehistory and in the early Roman period. We know that there's sort of an ebb and flow in settlement numbers later on, medieval period and beyond, but it's always been sort of taken as read that this is sort of a densely wooded backwater where maybe bandits go up into the hills and, you know, jab at the Romans and run up in the hills, or, you know, it's not the sort of place where a lot of people are living. And even in the 70s, there was a paper published by a chap called Saunders, and he said Celtic field systems, which are all over the North Wessex Downs, don't exist in the Chilterns, with very few exceptions. And we can flip that on its head now, because the reason people thought they weren't there is because they couldn't see them. We have field systems in their hundreds across the Chilterns that have come up from this LiDAR survey. And we could probably double that figure thanks to a nice little piece of work my colleague Ed did. I hope you can see here, here's the A404. On the north side of the A404, this is a heavily plowed field. Down here, this is heavily wooded. And you can probably see the difference in the LiDAR. It's much smoother and cleaner here because it hasn't had to ping down through all the trees. Here, it's a little more pebble dashed because all those laser points have had to fight their way down to the ground. So heavily wooded here, for that reed protected, not plowed over the last several hundred years. This bit, plowed consistently. In both fields, you can see all these sort of random dots, right? They're not quite random, are they? Can you see they're in straight lines? And if we look at these here, we can actually see faint white lines connecting them. Now, those faint white lines are actually earthworks, and these are field systems. The dark pits are what's left from a practice called marling, where you increase the fertility of the soil by digging down into the chalk and then plowing the chalk into the soil. And obviously you wouldn't put a pit in the center of your field because you want to grow on it. You do it in the corners. So what we have, like a child's connect the dots puzzle, we've got all these dark dots, which are the marling pits at the edges of these field systems. And these are probably early Roman field systems. They are in shape and characteristic very similar to the later Iron Age ones, later prehistoric ones, but marling, we know, is a practice that sort of came into common use in the early Roman period. So we have late prehistoric, early Roman fields here, and possibly we could start to think about these pits which show up in lots of fields in the LiDAR, but without earthworks. We can think of those pits as a proxy for more of those field systems. So we have literally hundreds of field systems where scholars like Saunders thought there were none. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we're not looking at a densely wooded landscape. We are probably looking at a late prehistoric Roman landscape where you have managed woodland for coppicing, for creation of charcoal and timber needs, but largely an open landscape, which is being heavily and intensely farmed. And that changes everything we think, not only about the land use, but about population numbers as well. You're not going to be intensely farming this place if there aren't people to eat it, right? So this LiDAR survey and our interpretation of it has sort of flipped the narrative about the Chilterns. It's a very busy place, most likely, in later prehistory and early Roman. Right, so I'm just going to talk just briefly, I'll see if I'm running out of time. No, we're doing all right. About some other aspects of the project, because I could talk about LiDAR until you're asleep, and some of you maybe, but some of the practical things that we're also doing or had done up until COVID and hope to do again in the spring. Are geophysical survey, some excavation, doing ground truthing. Now, ground truthing of LiDAR is really important. Sometimes it's called field checking. And I think maybe I like field checking better because in archaeology, there is no single truth. But we field check LiDAR results because sometimes the thing looks really good on the LiDAR as a feature. And then you go out into the real world and see it and go, I was mistaken. And one of the big things that can fool you on that is a large mound. So if you look at the LiDAR of a large mound, it will look very much like a Bronze Age barrow. And you can get very excited that you have discovered a brand new Bronze Age barrow on some farmer's field. And then you go out to visit the site and realize that he's just been dumping his manure there in the corner of the field for about 5 years. And it's a massive mound. LiDAR can't discriminate between that. So you really do need to visit some of these sites to ground truth them. Other stuff we've been doing is scrub clearance. I talked about that, finding that balance between habitat and heritage. So we do clear some areas where the vegetation is very supportive of burrowing life. We also have done some things and are going to be doing some things over the winter, felling trees where they are either a damage, a danger, people visiting the site, or dangerous for blowing over, like that picture I showed of Ed with the root plate, with the tree that had fallen over. The root plate can rip up a lot of precious archaeology. So we're doing a lot of tree surveys to decide what trees should be thinned or felled or have their canopies reduced so that we can protect the archaeology as well. Just a few images of the kind of training we've been doing or used to do and hope to do again. Guided walks, good old-fashioned plane table, hasher plan drawing. Still good to know basic skills, even if you have got all the answers from the LiDAR. And what we had done in the first 2 years of the project, and may do again towards the end, is offer free GIS training. Now, this isn't something that you need to use the LiDAR. It isn't something that, that you need to be trained in to be helpful on the project. But a lot of our volunteers belong to local archaeological or historical societies, and being able to produce their own distribution maps or maps and plans and drawings for society reports or to report on the archaeology they've been doing. That's a skill that could be very expensive if you have to pay for GIS training. So we put this on as part of the project, free training, and we probably will have one more session before the end of the project next year. We did things like, we had a day of celebrating ancient farming techniques, and we talked about everything from Neolithic sickles made of flint, right the way through to relatively modern scything practices. And we all had a go learning how to scythe, which was great fun. We do work with a lot of other project partners. Here you can see we're working with the Chiltern Rangers in High Wycombe, removing fly tipping from Desborough Castle. Again, more scrub clearance. On Pulpit Hill, we were helping the National Trust cut back ash dieback saplings and using that to create wattle fences to keep the mountain bikers from enjoying the ramparts in the way that sometimes they want to do. And as I said, guided walks, and we've started these up again now. I should have several more of them in the upcoming spring. It's just a great way to get out into the landscape and walk and talk about the archaeology and share it with people. As I said, we went into classrooms. This is my colleague Ed teaching the teachers how to make prehistory exciting for primary school. We had a workshop very early on in the project. Was keen not to go into schools and say, oh, we have a mandate to help you teach prehistory. Here's some printouts and some coloring sheets of around how to have fun. Because teachers have a very limited amount of time. And I think for me, it was important to ask teachers, what do you want us to do? So we held a workshop and most of them said, we haven't got time to learn prehistory. We haven't got time to go home at night and read Wikipedia and hope that we're going to learn enough about it to teach the students. So they wanted to know, where can we get good information on prehistory? And we were really excited about doing this. Remember, this is pre-COVID. There wasn't a lot of online resources, and we were creating this online learning zone for all the teachers. And then, of course, COVID hit. Everybody went teaching online. Everyone and their cousin created all this wonderful stuff on British prehistory. So we don't need to do that anymore. So it was a bit disappointing to be almost at the forefront of something, and then but the problem is solved. So that's actually a good thing. So the one thing that we are doing for the schools is we've created a resource kit of replica artifacts that they can have in the classroom, both in the real world. So we have some boxes of practical artifacts that people get their hands on, But we've also created 3D models of these that they can throw up on the whiteboard, rotate in plane, show virtual artifacts, and then the kids can have a go at like building them out of different materials. And so that's catching on, I hope, quite well. We used to do things called pop-up prehistories, and again, hope to do them in the spring. The first one in the spring will be in April at Burnham Beeches. This is where we get living history and experimental archaeologists to come together and create experiences about prehistory for families. We had copper smelting, making Iron Age coins, making wattle and daub walls, making Iron Age pottery, and the fantastic Kim Biddulph here doing Iron Age cookery. Always very well received, and how wonderful to be in a Hillfort space and see these things come alive. We had a lot of really positive feedback from that. We can't wait to do it again. I mentioned the interpretation panels and the bespoke art. One of the things I was really keen on was not to replicate all the Hillfort panels I've ever seen, good or bad, around the country. It's always green, it's always sunny. The Iron Age was just a swathe of green with roundhouses in it. And I was keen for some of the artwork to reflect different sorts of conditions. So here we have Medmenham Camp, and it's snowing, and the moon's rising, and it's a different sort of environment, which helps us to remember that, you know, it was a varied experience living in the past, just as it is now. Not always those green interpretation panels, although we've got plenty of those as well. Just some images of some of the artwork. So there are 17 new reconstructions for 17 of the Hillforts across the Chilterns, and these are going up on new panels. The panels will also have QR codes on them that take you to digital media, three-dimensional LiDAR fly-throughs of the site, and lots of extra add-ons. This is Ivinghoe Beacon, that site that I mentioned, the earliest of our Chiltern Hillforts. This is a site that is being loved to death. Anyone who's been up there will recognize the white scar of the pathway that goes up. So the Hillfort sits at the top, as you would imagine, of the hill. There are some Bronze Age barrows on the approach to it. But 800,000 visitors a year are loving this to death. And many of them want to do the right thing. So when this is all mucky and quagmiry and slimy, people think, oh, I won't walk in that, I'm making the erosion worse. I'll walk over here and it'll make it better. But of course, they are just widening the path. Every time I go up there, there's bits and pieces of late Bronze Age or Iron Age pots sort of falling out of the ruts or out of mole hills. This is a very fragile environment. So with the help of Historic England and National Trust, the project has advised on erosion mitigation, and a project will be starting in the spring to create a more permanent and robust path up there. So that's, again, another real success, I think, for the project. I'd shown before the LiDAR of the Wye Valley. So this is Wickham, West Wickham here, and Desborough Castle here. This is our interpretation of what it would have looked like if those two Hillforts are contemporary. As I say, we have no dating, solid dating for Desborough Castle. We assume that West Wickham, based on some pot shards, is somewhere around 500, 400 BC. But for the sake of this artwork, we've decided that they are contemporary on either side of the chalk stream, the River Wye. We've done some work here, not doing geophysics, just to remind us where we are. This is the Anarchy period earthworks. This is the rampart of the Iron Age Hillfort, preserved probably in the line of this road that was put in the mid-18th century. So you can imagine the Hillfort probably comes around here, and we know it was under these buildings because when Castlefield Estate was built, there was some observation of the ditch there. So all that's left really is this really slight earthwork here. We did geophysics. The ubiquitous William Wintle, Dr. William Wintle of Oxford University, came out and taught some of our volunteers how to do geophysics. That doesn't look really spectacular, but hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. You can see the ditch and bank here showing up, but more interestingly is this really deep pit and another series of smaller pits inside the Iron Age enclosure. So we're not really interested in this medieval nonsense. We're interested in this prehistoric bit, and there'll be a community excavation here in late June, early July. I'm very excited about that because it will get people in the community in the trench, learning about the archaeology, learning archaeological practice, but also getting invested in their local archaeology. A Hillfort right in the heart of High Wycombe. I mean, that's fantastic. And hopefully that will lead to less of this because people will begin to care about it more. This is what Desborough Castle looks like almost any given day. Or it's an unwritten rule that if you have a ditch and a bank, you must have a sofa and 3 mattresses as well. One of the other things that we've done as far as excavation goes is at the Hillfort at Seven Ways Plain. This is down in Burnham Beeches, just outside of Slough. And here you can see the enclosure of 3/4 of the Hillfort. We had no date for this Hillfort, no evidence for it at all, no proper excavation on it. This large bite that was taken out of it is the product of Ministry of Defence. Some of you may know that Burnham Beeches is where most of the Normandy invasion vehicles were parked to disguise them from the Luftwaffe underneath all those lovely beech trees. When they left and decamped in 1946, they pulled up all the barbed wire and iron, and they dug a big hole in the Hillfort and buried 70 tons of it. It's funny because the Ministry of Defence was cautioned to look after all the veteran trees in Burnham Beeches and look after the oaks and all these fantastic ancient pollards. And there were photographs of officers and men with sandbags around the trees, taking great pains not to damage them. They weren't advised at all about the Iron Age archaeology, so they just dig this massive hole in it. But they did have other things on their mind, so I'm inclined to overlook it. 70 tons of rusted iron wasn't probably where I wanted to put a trench full of volunteers. So we decided to put a slot across this linear bank and ditch that runs in and across the Hillfort. It's always been called an Iron Age ditch on no evidence whatsoever. So we put in a trench, and over the course of 2 weeks, opened up this very small trench and had, would you believe, 84 volunteers in this trench over the course of 2 weeks. They signed up for a 4-hour training session. And at the beginning, I was quite skeptical because I thought, how much archaeology can the complete novice learn in 4 hours? But rather a lot. Excavation, recording, reading soils, blessed by the fact that there were no artifacts whatsoever, which makes post-excavation very easy. My camera's decided to take a wobble, but that's not that important. Here you can see some of our happy volunteers digging, and I have to give credit to Robin Bashford here, a freelance archaeologist who supervised the site and trained 84 people in archaeological practice over the course of 2 weeks. Absolutely phenomenal. Now, this year we were to have returned and had another community excavation, but unfortunately COVID made that very, very difficult. The idea of having that many people rotating in and out of a small trench was not something that my risk assessment was very pleased with. So we went a different way. I do apologize. I'm not making anyone seasick. My camera's decided to be very strange. Oh well, you don't need to see me. So we've got, again, Seven Ways Plain. We were going to put a trench across here with volunteers. That wasn't able to happen. So I decided I would dig it myself. A single slot across the ditch and bank with the sole purpose of trying to come across dating evidence. Like I said earlier, we have no idea where in that range of the Hillfort dating, or the Hillfort building era, if you like, where that Seven Ways Plain fits in. And it would be very useful to know this. So a trench was opened up on the 27th of October, and for 7 days straight, I excavated, largely on my own. I did have help at a weekend, but the idea was to keep one person in a small trench and look for that evidence. Well, the Ministry of Defence surprised me again. As I say, I knew that they'd put that big hole in the earthwork up at the entrance. I didn't know that they'd done anything in the ditch. I had hoped to dig down into the unmolested fills of an Iron Age ditch and get some good dating evidence, but they'd been there before me. And we've got this large concrete pillar or base, which I think may have held a gun emplacement. Good dating evidence, a 1941 halfpenny, and a 1919, which is residual or something old in someone's pockets. We all joked that perhaps they were being paid too much, the soldiers, if they could just throw this kind of money away. But it gave us good dating evidence for this World War II incursion into the Hillfort. I was very lucky in that, despite the fact that they had disturbed when they poured this concrete in 1941-42, when they poured this concrete, they didn't actually get to the very bottom of the ditch. They dug and disturbed all of this out, but I hope you can see with the line of the cursor, if you can see the soils, here is the profile of the Iron Age ditch coming down, and this little pocket of gray, brown, silty material here, this is actually the base of the ditch before it starts to rise again and then gets completely obliterated by all this. But this little pocket here is undisturbed material. And from that, I was able to recover not only some pieces of charcoal, but some pieces of daub. So from a handful of pieces of daub, that wattle and daub, that clay material that makes up a roundhouse, From a handful of that, I am, of course, as a prehistorian, extrapolating that to be an entire roundhouse that was in the Hillfort. Well, one could make the story that when the interior of the Hillfort gets out of use, a building is destroyed and some of that detritus is dumped down into the now unused ditch. I will get a radiocarbon date from the charcoal, and we will see if this is indicative of a date of the end of use of the Hillfort. But what would be even better would be understanding when the Hillfort was constructed. And here again, the gods were smiling on me. Very, very fortunate. In this sequence of gravels was a piece of charcoal, which can only have got there whilst those gravels were being thrown up in the building of the Hillfort. So it will be about a 6-month wait until I get the dates back from the radiocarbon lab. But fingers crossed that the charcoal is of good enough quality and quantity that we'll get a date range for the construction of the Hillfort and a date range for the destruction of the Hillfort, or the lack of use, not really the destruction. Just to show here how well you can see how that's constructed. I mean, they built this by digging a ditch and throwing those horizons up. And you can see the darker, siltier soil here where they initially start to dig through the soil. And the capping bit is that nice, clean, almost natural gravel, because they're going down into the natural gravel to keep throwing material up. It's a lovely way to look at the construction of very simple earthwork. It attracted about 500 visitors while I was out there over the course of 7 days. And it also attracted the Lord Mayor of London, who was coming out to do some sort of ceremonial pollarding because the Corporation of London owns Burnham Beaches. But he apparently had studied archaeology at school and so wanted to see the trench. So I had a celebrity visitor. The other thing that I had done, just because I wasn't sure how many visitors could come, and as I say, we had over 500 over the course of a week, I recorded and made summary videos at the end of every day. So if you're curious, do go to the Chilterns Conservation Board YouTube channel, and you can see me wittering on even more than I've wittered on tonight on the practice of excavating this trench every single day. You can see it from when the string gets laid out to when the last backfill goes in, the story of a trench in 7 days. I think I have probably bored you enough with all the things the project has been doing. If you are amongst the Twitterati, then you can follow me on Hillfortian. If you'd like to look at that LiDAR, the address is chilternsbeacons.org. If you want to watch the videos, they are on the YouTube channel for the Chilterns Conservation Board. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you for listening.